your blood sugar, your blood glucose essentially starts to go up. Well, why would it go up? Well, it means that more sugar is around, there's more glucose to be available to your brain. And the way your body does that is by making certain cells resistant to insulin, right? So your blood glucose goes up so that your brain gets more glucose to do its job
all the
better.
energy I might need to figure out what
and it
I
increases
need to
energy,
do.
right?
Okay.
What else happens? Your blood pressure goes up. Again, why would your blood pressure go up? Well, it can deliver more oxygen to your brain. These are all good things when you literally are in danger. Your blood becomes more prone to clotting. That's fantastic, because if you were attacked and that lion was to cut you, instead of bleeding to death, your blood's going to clot quickly.
That's amazing. So it's like getting prepared for the fact I'm going to get eaten by the
our
lion,
bodies are,
and it's already like changing what will happen.
Our bodies are incredibly clever, right? And another thing I think it's worth thinking about is that our amygdala, the emotional part of our brain, goes onto high alert.
Okay.
So we become hyper vigilant for all the threats around us. Now, let's think about that, Jonathan. That is a really good and clever response from your body when you really are in danger. The problem today in the 21st century for many of us is that our stress response systems are being activated to the state of our daily lives, by our email inboxes, by our to-do lists, by our 3 social media channels we're trying to stay up to date with, etc., etc.
So literally, are you saying that like the little thing beeps on my phone and my body like starts to clot my blood because I think I might get eaten by a lion? Like it's
It
really
is. We know that our body responds to physical stress and emotional stress in a very similar way. And that's why these days, if your stress response system has been activated to the state of your daily life, which it is for so many of us, those short-term responses that are so helpful become harmful in the long term. So blood glucose going up helps you for 30 minutes to get away from danger. But if that's happening day in, day out to the state of your life, that makes you tired. You're going to put on weight, particularly around your belly. And ultimately, it's going to cause type 2 diabetes. And a lot of people don't realize, Jonathan, that you can raise your blood sugar. You can get type 2 diabetes just from chronic stress alone. It's not just diet and exercise.
So I just want to make sure I've really heard that right, because I think it's probably be quite shocking for a lot of people, because I think I was definitely brought up with this idea that your brain and your body are two completely separate things. But what you're saying is just that continued stress, week in, month after month, year after year, alone could lead to like really severe, life-threatening diseases like diabetes.
I had a patient once, Jonathan, about 6 or 7 years ago, who was a renal registrar in a hospital in Manchester at the time. And, her diet wasn't amazing, but it was okay. And she, would move her body reasonably regularly. She became pre-diabetic. And when we looked at everything in her life, when we sort of tried to understand what was going on, it was stress that was driving it. When we helped her dramatically reduce her stress levels over a period of months, and she managed to do that, her HbA1c, her average blood sugar, started to come down out of the pre-diabetic range and into the normal range. I think 21st century living has become very stressful for so many of us. And what I really want to do with this conversation with you, Jonathan, is to make sure people understand that stress has real biological effects on your body, but then also to say it's not as hard as you think it is to bring those levels down. You don't have to suddenly go off and live in a monastery and meditate all day, right? That would be great for your stress levels for most people, but that's not practical. So we will get to those practical strategies. But just to go back to that evolutionary response for a moment.
Yeah.
Blood glucose in the short term helps you, in the long term harms you. Blood pressure going up because you think there's a lion there, or because you're in a 30-minute spinning class in the gym, that's a great thing. You don't want your blood pressure going up, though, day in, day out. That's when it increases the risk of heart attacks or strokes.
This comes up quite often, actually, in very different areas. I think about Sarah Berry talking often about like what happens inside your body when you eat food. And she says, your blood sugar going up after a meal is a perfectly normal response, but it's sort of, it happens, then it comes back down. What's bad is like this very prolonged period, with sort of modern food and modern eating, where you're just doing this like meal after meal and there's these big excursions. And is that something similar with stress, where you're saying, is being stressed from time to time bad for you? Or is it only if it's sort of like over, it's almost sort of permanently on?
I think you raise a great point there, Jonathan. Stress is not all bad.
Okay.
We need stress to be the best version of ourselves. We need stress because it helps us perform better. But there is a dosed response with stress. Let's say I was a bit nervous to have this conversation with you, Jonathan, today, or I had to give a talk on stage and I was a little bit nervous. I was feeling a little bit stressed. Well, actually, we know the little bit of stress is going to help me perform better. I'm going to be able to pull little bits of information from parts of my brain and actually deliver better information to you than if I was maybe not stressed. But if those stress levels get up too high and I start to get, really stressed, I don't know what Jonathan's going to ask me. Am I going to know what to say? My brain can start to freeze, right? And then I no longer am performing better, I'm actually performing worse. And so there's a really nice curve that I sort of put in my second book, The Stress Solution, where I sort of outline all the causes of stress. And it basically shows that a little bit helps us, a little bit more, you start to get diminishing returns. And then if it keeps going, it turns out to be downright harmful. And so let's think about the hippocampus in the brain, for example. It does many things, but it's usually associated with memory.
Okay.
So a little bit of stress helps us remember more things, but chronic stress, day in, day out, our stress loads, starts to kill nerve cells in the hippocampus.
Doesn't sound good.
It's not good, and we now know that chronic unrelenting stress is causative. It's one of the causative factors for dementia.
Is that right?
Yeah, so I don't say that to scare people. I'm not saying that's the only thing, right? That's clearly there's many things in our environment that increases the risk that we're going to get Alzheimer's when we're older. Poor diet, sleep deprivation, all kinds of things play a role, but so does chronic stress.
So again, for people listening who've felt somehow that all this mental stuff doesn't have anything to do with your body, there's another example of there's this real link between stress, constantly on for months and years, actually causing, again, another really serious disease.
And if people are skeptical, let's imagine a everyday scenario where you can understand straight away how emotional thoughts, psychological stress can impact your physiology. You could be sitting in an exam hall and feeling the time pressure, feeling you don't know how to answer these questions and feel a real urge to go to the toilet. That is emotional stress translating to your physiology, right? It's a very simple way.
It's a really brilliant example
of demonstrating that. And, just to go back to those short-term responses that are helpful in the short term but harmful in the long term, we mentioned the amygdala there, the emotional part of our brain. Well, if there's a lion approaching, you want to be hypervigilant to everything all around you. If you are in a dark street in London on a Friday night, or New York, or LA, and you are walking back by yourself to your car and you think someone is following you, you want to be hypervigilant.
Yep.
That's an appropriate response. If, though, your stress response is being activated day in, day out to the state of your life, your amygdala being on high alert is what we call anxiety. And so we know that anxiety rates are going through the roof these days. And again, there's many different causes, including the food that you eat and the impact on the microbiome and the gut-brain axis, for sure. But we shouldn't underestimate just how powerful effects chronic stress has. And again, bringing it back to the last point you made, Jonathan, the key is not that we should never be stressed. That's unrealistic. It's not what we want. It's just that we need to understand where stress lives in our life so that we can try and reduce it where possible. And even if we can't reduce it, we can bring into our lives some stress reduction strategies that are going to make a really big difference.
That's brilliant. So if I understand what you're saying, I think you're saying being stressed for something particular, I'm going to go and do a race that I'm excited about, or I'm about to perform in a podcast and I want to make sure I'm going to do a good job because Rangan's here and I don't want to appear like a total amateur. That's all right if my stress level goes back down afterwards and across the day, most of the time my stress is low and it's peaking. That may even be good. But if somehow I'm stuck in this thing being on, this stress level being on all the time, day after day, then I can end up with anxiety. I can end up with these direct physical illnesses because somehow in this modern world, my responses are no longer just getting switched on with the lion and getting switched off when he leaves. It's almost like you've left the light on and it's just sort of permanently on.
Yeah, exactly. And another helpful concept, Jonathan, I think, is something I've been talking to my patients about for years and also the public. And it's the concept of micro stress doses, or I abbreviate them to MSDs. A micro stress dose is a dose of stress that in isolation we can handle just fine. The problem is when those micro stress doses build up one after the other.
You said at the beginning like that you're seeing a lot more stress even than 10 years ago. So what is causing stress today?
Okay, there's two ways of answering that question. Let me first of all answer it through the lens of micro stress doses, right? These little hits of stress that in isolation we can handle just fine. The problem arises when they mount up, because when they mount up, they get us closer and closer to what I call our personal stress threshold. And it's going to be different. Yours is going to be different from mine. Mine's going to be different from my wife's. But here's the thing we have to understand. When we hit our personal stress thresholds, that's when things start to go wrong. That's when our back goes into spasm, our neck goes. That's when we overreact to an email and send one back that we regret. That's when we have a row with our partner. We always think it was the last thing that happened that was the problem. But in my experience, it very rarely is the last thing. It was simply the straw that broke the camel's back. So what does that look like? Well, let's imagine a typical scenario that I see in many of my patients, right? They're super stressed with their job. So they don't want to go to bed on time because they want to have a bit of me time in the evening and chill out in front of Netflix watching a box set, right? So they go to bed a bit late, let's say midnight, and the next morning, their alarm goes off at 6 a.m. So this is how these micro stress doses, or MSDs, start to add up very quickly. You're lying in bed in a deep sleep. Your phone alarm goes off. That's micro stress dose number one because it's jolted you out of your deep sleep. You look at the time and think, oh, God, I've got 5 more minutes. You press snooze. You fall back asleep. 5 minutes later, it wakes you up again. MSD number 2. Then you pick up your smartphone. You quickly go to your email inbox and go, oh man, there's 3 work emails from yesterday I didn't get on top of. I'm going to have to do that. Micro stress dose number 3. Then you go onto Twitter or X and see some of the negative headlines that are on there. Micro stress dose number 4. Then you realize, wow, I should have got up from bed 20 minutes ago.
So you haven't even got out of bed yet and you're already quite stressed.
Yeah, and I would find with most of my patients that before they even left their house in the morning, they had been exposed to 10 or 15 micro stress doses. And what does that mean? It means you are so much closer to your own personal stress threshold, which means it doesn't take much in the day to tip you over. And that has been one of the most useful concepts for my patients to help them understand stress, because there's 2 ways of looking at that. First of all, can we reduce how many of these micro stress doses we're exposed to each morning? Perhaps by not looking at our emails or our phone first thing, perhaps by having a cup of coffee in silence or having a little workout or some meditation, whatever it might be, so you're not building up those MSDs in the morning. But also, if you do have a stressful life and you've got young children you're trying to get off to school and you're trying to get to work and all these kind of things, just understand that in the day, can you take regular pauses and do things that will, let's say you're building up your stress load, that then brings you away, like a 15-minute walk at lunchtime without your phone, can start to lower that stress load on your body.
What I'm intrigued by, because you started this story talking about like 200,000 years ago, like with the lion, I'm sort of intrigued by how our modern environment is different maybe from the environment in which we live, because we talk a lot about that on the podcast to do with things like our food and your bacteria and things like this. I'm struck that a lot of the examples you describe feel like things that didn't exist, like actually even maybe like 200 years ago for anybody. Is that
I would
is that
agree
by chance, or is that?
I would absolutely agree with that. I've looked quite carefully at this, and I think a very simple way of looking at this is, let's be really clear, let's not look at the past through rose-tinted lenses. There was real life-threatening stress there. There was wild predators, there was danger, there was all kinds of things. You could
starve to death, presumably.
You could starve to death, exactly. But their stress was a real physical threat to their survival. And from what we can tell, their lives basically were mostly in the parasympathetic state, the relaxation state, and it was punctuated by brief moments of high stress, which they dealt with. Whereas in the modern world, it's almost been flipped. Whereas we are constantly having our sympathetic nervous system, the stress part of our nervous system, constantly activated from the minute we wake up to the minute we go to sleep at night. And we're only occasionally really having that relaxation, having that rest and digest mode activated in our body. And if we think about, what are some of those stressors in the modern world compared to, our evolutionary ancestors? Well, the list is endless. Light exposure at the wrong part of the day is a huge stressor on our bodies, right? Back then it used to be light in the morning, gets you out, helps set your circadian rhythm. You're doing things in the day, you're working in the day, but when it's nighttime in the evening, it's campfire time. You light a fire. It's now no longer the work of the day. It's storytelling, it's dance, singing. We know that from tribes that the evening, they sort of downshift into relaxation mode. And I really like that concept for us when we think about stress of campfire time. What do you do in the evening? Do you have your own version of campfire time? Or are you constantly on, still doing emails, still going on to social media, trying to win an argument with someone from the other side of the world who you don't know, or whatever it might be? Or are you really taking a bit of time to connect? If you're lucky enough to live with friends or family or partners, how many times do we sit, let's say, in our kitchen with our partner, so we're physically in the same space, but mentally, because we're both on our own devices, we're a million miles away, right? So yes, I agree with you. It's very different today. I think I would argue today, right? And I've been a doctor now for 22 years, right? I've seen tens of thousands of patients. I would argue, based upon what I've seen, that stress is the number one cause of illness that I see today.
That's extraordinary.
Right? I really do believe that.
Number one cause.
In the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2013, there was an editorial letter where they proposed that 60 to 80% of what a medical doctor sees in any given day is in some way related to stress. And the other researchers is sort of hypothesizing that it could be as much as 90%. But I think if you look at the totality of the research, I think we can safely say between 60 and 90% of what a medical doctor like me sees in any given day is in some way related to stress. And Jonathan, let's just think about that stress response, right? It can affect every organ system in the body. It can increase your risk of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, obesity, anxiety, depression. But what about two broad categories of symptoms? One of them that you will have covered a lot on your podcast, gut problems and libido problems, right? I mentioned before that when you feel stressed, or when a human being feels stressed, it activates all the processes that are necessary for survival, but it also switches off two very important functions. Digestion gets shut down because if your body thinks that you have to run away from a tiger, right, or you mentioned a lion, digesting your food efficiently and adequately is not a priority, right? Number two, libido. In over 20 years of seeing patients, the number of patients I'm now seeing who are having problems with their libido, their sex drive basically, is just going through the roof. And I'm seeing it in younger and younger ages. It's absolutely incredible. And there are many different causes of that, but I would say that stress is one of the biggest causes of low libido. Because if you're chronically feeling under stress, your body feels that it's in danger. So, your body doesn't feel it needs to be able to chill out and procreate with your partner. And this is a really serious issue that a lot of people, I think, don't recognize enough.